Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure and such an honor to be part of this series of talks. Thank you so much to Jay for this invitation and to Michael for helping organize things. The title of my talk, you heard, it's a mouthful, so I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not very good with titles, but I'm going to kind of dive into the talk now. And I'm excited to hear people's feedback and like what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, because it's something that's kind of new. So it's kind of both exciting and terrifying to be presenting it. So if you were a reader of the New York Black Press in the spring of 1922, you would have been invited to follow two kinds of African literary events. The first was the publication of the English translation of René Maran's Batoila, which a year prior had been awarded the Prix Goncourt. Even though Maran was from the Caribbean, the African setting of his novel and the claims of the novel to literary realism led to it being reviewed as an African novel. And Michel Fabre writes a lot about this, kind of how Batoila gets taken as this kind of African reference point. Right? And it was as such that it gets reviewed in the African American press. The second, and kind of less well-known now, African literary event that people might have been following in the Black New York press in the spring of 1922 was the Negro World's publication of The Sojourner, which was a poem by Ghanaian writer and activist Kobina Sekyi. Originally serialized in 5 parts in the Gold Coast Leader between 1919 and 1921, Sekyi's poem detailed the political awakening of an elite African student residing in Britain, traced his subsequent return to West Africa, and prophesied the dawn of an African and Afro-diasporic golden age. The Sojourner was one of the longest poems ever to be published in the Negro World, second only to Garvey's The Tragedy of White Injustice from 1927. And I think if we can maybe put the slides on, we can see kind of what the first, what it looks like, so we can have a sense of, so maybe let's skip to the next slide. Okay, so this is a really grainy scan, but you can see kind of in the middle of the 3 columns, that's all the Sojourner. So and that is a big newspaper page. So that's how long that poem is, and as I said, it is really conspicuous because of its size. You wouldn't necessarily see poems as long as that published in the Negro World, even though it's a journal which published a lot of poems. So when it appeared in this May 13, 1922 number of the Negro World, The Sojourner was printed not just as a standalone poem, but also as an inaugural poem in a kind of series of loosely connected texts by Sekyi, or poems by Sekyi. And in an accompanying note, the literary editor, William Ferris, announced the Negro World's readers would be reading more of Sekyi's philosophical poems in the weeks to come. And the note states, and let me see, I think the slide says, yes, so you can see the slide. It's an editor's note, Mr. Kobina Sekyi. So the note states that, I quote, Mr. Kobina Sekyi, the author of the poems, is a BA and BL of London University and a member of the Gold Coast West Africa Bar. Mr. Sekyi is one of the few educated natives who has been able to apply Western intellectual influence to African need. From week to week, Mr. Sekyi's philosophical poems will be published on this page, end of quote. The inclusion of this note is all the more interesting here, given that the Negro World did not usually provide such information about its poets. After all, this is a paper that printed an extraordinary amount of poetry, both by well-regarded authors, but also by amateurs and young writers. So this might explain why these bylines typically would only include the writer's name and the location. That would be it. And sometimes not even the location. And you can kind of see, in the slide, so there's a poem, Kenya Cries to God by R.T. Brown. There's not very much information about Brown, but then the Sojourner gets this note, right? So that's already kind of conspicuous. And this note actually kind of gave a decent amount of information, even though it's short. So it listed Sekyi's educational credentials, and it introduced him to the Negro World's readership as, I quote, one of the few educated natives who has been able to apply Western intellectual influence to African need, end quote. It is unclear if the Negro World's readers would have known what exactly Ferris meant by that, but I'm assuming that what he meant was that Sekyi was mobilizing his British legal training and his education and various British literary forms, not to praise, but to criticize and ask for the abolition of British rule. As historian Jones Quartey has argued, I quote, the more European philosophy Sekyi read, the more African he became in his arguments for the restoration of the Akan-Fante state system, end of quote. Finally, Ferris's note offered an aesthetic value judgment about Sekyi's literary style and themes by categorizing it as, or his poems as, philosophical. The very fact that he had committed to publishing not one, but multiple Sekyi poems was a sign of Ferris's approval of Sekyi's style and themes. True to his word, Ferris continued to publish Sekyi's poems that spring and actually through the summer. And if we can maybe go to the next couple of slides. You can just have a sense of, oh, what happened? Yes, okay. So we get a sense of kind of what these other poems look like. So they're much shorter, as you can see, than the Sojourner. And I think, can we go to the next slide too? So you see it continues to June. Is there another one? Let me just see. So yeah, so here it goes up all the way up to July, and I think there'll be more poems in 1927. But I just wanted to show you kind of that this became kind of a serial event. Not the Sojourner, the poem, but kind of Sekyi becomes a serial author on the pages of the Negro World. Thank you, Michael. And I apologize for the graininess of these scans. So while I mentioned the series of Sekyi poems that appeared in the Negro World in 1922, my talk will focus specifically on one poem, The Sojourner. But I'll be looking at two different editions of that poem. The one that appeared originally in the Gold Coast Leader, which is a Ghanaian paper, and then the other one in the Negro World, which is a Black internationalist paper associated with Garvey, published out of New York, but read worldwide. I'm interested in this reprint of the poem in the Negro World because of the new editorial apparatus that was imposed on it by its literary editor, Ferris. Now, Ferris imposed on the poem this editorial apparatus in different ways. And what I mean by this is he reformatted the poem. It's no longer serial. It's all kind of collated into one page. He inserted a key footnote and gloss. And then there's also this aforementioned introductory note, right, that kind of frames the poem for a new readership. Finally, this new edition was missing an entire fifth section, entire installment, which was entitled To Albion. So what we get in the Negro World is actually an installment short. These editorial interventions that I mentioned point to Ferris's attempt to prop up the diasporic décalage between the poem's original readers in the Gold Coast press and its new readership in the Negro World. A significant part of this readership was African American and Caribbean. And here it is important to note that this poem already thematically addresses the existence of a diasporic décalage. So it's happening on the level of theme, but I mentioned what happens to this when these editorial interventions happen, right? So an entire section of the poem is devoted to the comparison between the brutal legacies of slavery in the Americas and the lingering legacies of what he terms slavery in a milder strain. And this is his formulation, not mine. But what I will try to show is that when Ferris intervened into Sekyi's framing of this kind of uneven effect of colonization and slavery across the Black Atlantic, he did this kind of an editorial level, and it does change things a bit how we read the poem. So what I'm suggesting then is that the Negro World's reprinting of The Sojourner produced a new edition of the poem, one that rearticulates the diasporic décalage between African Americans and West Africans. And by rearticulates here, I mean that this new edition configures décalage slightly differently to the way that the Gold Coast Leader had. And this is kind of the overarching claim of the talk. The rest of the talk is divided into three sections. Can we just, I think, yes, okay, perfect, thank you. So in the first part, I will examine the original Gold Coast Leader's version of the poem, and then we'll situate its titular figure, the Sojourner, within a Ghanaian and West African discourse. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to attend to the effects of Ferris's editorial interventions, what I've just kind of mentioned very briefly now, and what happens to them in the Negro World. And then in the third, I'm going to examine what happens to the poem's titular Sojourner as he gets recalibrated in the pages of the Negro World and appears alongside figures of Black mobility, displacement, and alienation that are more specific to the US Caribbean and sometimes can get associated with the literature of the new Negro movement, but also to actual figures. So not just a trope, but also a way of describing political figures. Okay. So part one. When the Gold Coast Leader published the first installment of the Sojourner, Sekyi was already a household name in the Gold Coast. Moreover, he was already known for writing about the sojourns of elite Fante students in Britain. His serial novella, The Anglo-Fante, had recently been published in the London-based paper West Africa, and there it had received a great deal of attention. And it was also kind of discussed in the actual West African press, and not just this journal called West Africa in London, but also in the Gold Coast. So when the first installment of The Sojourner came out, it is not surprising that the editor of the Gold Coast Leader specifically referenced the Anglo-Fante in his introduction to this new poem. Anyone who had read the Anglo-Fante amongst these new readers would have immediately noticed the marked similarities between these two works. In both texts, we follow a kind of Bildungs narrative of a Fante student who is first educated in British colonial schools, so locally, and then travels to the British imperial metropolis for a university education. Interestingly enough, the Anglo-Fante had actually reworked some aspects of the earlier play that he wrote called The Blinkard. So we see he keeps kind of returning to this figure of the sojourner and thinking about the sojourn kind of as key for thinking through questions of West African modernity. So in all of these texts, the colonial African student's sojourn exposes him, and for Sekyi, the sojourner is always male, to the grim realities behind myths of Anglo-superiority, Anglo-civilization, and the sojourner returns to West Africa changed forever. It was as if Sekyi had decided to rewrite parts of the Blinkards and then the Anglo-Fante into the Sojourner, the poem, only he did this in verse. So it seems like he's working out the same problematic in all these different forms. And what this suggests then is that for Sekyi, the figure of the Sojourner was a problem for thought and a kind of stock allegorical character through which to represent the political antinomies of Ghanaian modernity. The similarity between these two generically distinct texts, the novella, The Anglo-Fante, and the poem, The Sojourner, is underscored by the serial format in which they were parceled out to their readers. Like The Anglo-Fante, The Sojourner was published on an installment plan, and the aptness of this serial format came into high relief when Sekyi published a fifth part to this poem, an epilogue, almost 2 years after he had published the fourth installment, which would have probably been taken as the concluding one to the text at the time. Now, if we zoom out of the serialization of the Sojourner and consider the fact that, the fact that the serial poem was a reworking of the Sojourner figure from the Anglo-Fante, another serial, then we see that the Sojourner emerges as a serial figure twice over, right? He is fleshed out, so to speak, across multiple installments of first one text, the Anglo-Fante, then carried over to another, also serial text, the Sojourner. And given that Sekyi chose to serialize the Sojourner, but he didn't serialize other poems, and given the thematic resemblance between the Anglo-Fante and the Sojourner, we might be able to conclude that there is a kind of link between the poem's theme, the Sojourner, and character, the Sojourner, and this publication format, the serial. Across these multi-part texts, the charismatic figure of the Sojourner repeats, and therefore becomes associated with seriality too. And when I state that the Sojourner recurs in Sekyi's works, I want to clarify that he repeats with a difference, as Sekyi makes important changes to the Sojourner's story as he reworks this figure across the serial installments of two very different texts. The first two installments of the poem, and I'm talking about the Sojourner now, titled Untraveled and Abroad, follow the plot and characterization of the Anglo-Fante quite faithfully. So there we see kind of the same things happening basically to the two Sojourners, right? However, we begin to see different, very key differences between the fate of the Sojourner figure in the poem, the Sojourner, and that of the Sojourner called Kwesi in the earlier novella. And we see them in the third installment of the poem, which is entitled Retrospective. And as traumatic as the historical scenes of enslavement and colonization are in this installment, we do not get the sense that the protagonist will end up as tragically as his counterpart did in the Anglo-Fante. And what happens at the end of the Anglo-Fante, sorry for the spoiler, is he dies of a nervous disorder because he can't reconcile his Anglo and Fante social structures. So instead, the next fourth installment, entitled To Africa, presents us, this is again in the poem, presents us with a re-enchanted protagonist, re-enchanted by the attractions of Africa and disenchanted with the false universals of Britain. Now, this is a very different outcome of Kwesi in the Anglo-Fante, right? And the way that Stephanie Newell has kind of read Kwesi's death in the Anglo-Fante is to kind of think about the death as the impossibility of hyphenating identity, so hyphenating Anglo-Fante in a colonial setting. And according to Newell, Sekyi's ending suggests, I quote, that it is not possible to combine Fante and English cultural influences into a positive Anglo-Fante social model. Rather, each cultural identity is the other's satirical antithesis in a death-dealing dialectic with no resolution, end quote. By contrast, in the 1919 poem, the Sojourner section is not confronted with this dialectic. It's kind of rerouted, right? And instead of returning to community that expects the Sojourner to behave like a Black Englishman, this is what happens to Kwesi, the poem does not represent these kinds of scenes at all. Instead, the speaker interacts with these spirits of history instead. And you might ask then, how is the Sojourner a figure for African modernity in the poem if his most meaningful encounters are with spirits and with the past, right? And given that he does not interact with contemporaries. But although the title of this installment, I'm now talking about the third installment that came out, which is called Retrospective, although the title is retrospective, right, it is equally preoccupied with the future of Africa. The messianic temporal looping that we witness in this section makes it impossible to untangle the future from the past. The spirits instruct the Sojourner to, quote, learn that man may borrow the wisdom of tomorrow, who yesterday was teaching the sage that now is preaching, end quote. We hear Sekyi voice versions of this credo, to borrow from tomorrow and borrow from the past, right? This kind of weird looping across multiple forms of his writing, right? From newspaper articles to lectures and to poems. And as Newell has observed, Sekyi's efforts to, I quote, revive lost African worlds seems to be both idyllic and real, static and dynamic, timeless and recent, end quote. And here I want to add that even the forms and formats in which he sought to represent these African worlds are structured by these tensions between the static and the dynamic, the timeless and the recent. After all, Sekyi was calibrating both his serial literary texts and his serial essay series, and he has many of those, that deal with the quest to revive lost African worlds. He's recalibrating these serial texts to the cycles of print capitalism of the periodical. And as I've been trying to suggest, it is precisely the iterative cycle of periodicals that allows Sekyi to update his Sojourner figure and calibrate his crises and musings to the realities of his time as they're being reported on a weekly basis in the African-owned press. And the fact that he published an epilogue to the Sojourner entitled To Albion in November 1921, almost 2 years after the 4 installments of the Sojourner had come out, indicates that he was still working on the Sojourner and that he still understood his story to be a continuing one, with more installments to come. And we think about, novels having these continual stories, but here it seems that there's this poem that has multiple installments to come somehow. And this epilogue that's entitled To Albion sounds much like one of his newspaper articles, except it's written in verse. So its focus is actually not on the mythical Fante past anymore. It's not really about the Sojourner anymore either. Instead, it focuses on the insidious global influence of a world empire. So To Albion thus returns to the global scene that's being mapped out in the 3rd installment, Retrospective, and it zooms out from the Black Atlantic to some kind of shadowy totality that is in which it's difficult to locate a place that's not being influenced by Albion. And here it's worth adding that Sekyi's kind of, re-enchantment with this putatively lost African world that occurred in the 4th installment. So I mentioned kind of how there's a 4th installment that is titled To Africa, and there, instead of kind of the death that we see in the Anglo-Fante of the character, we see this kind of re-enchantment with Africa, right? That re-enchantment and that return to Africa, both kind of physical and metaphysical, is really only made possible by the hinge that is the 3rd part, which is the retrospective. And it is precisely in the part of the poem where he's able to bear witness to the parts of the past African world that he's invested in that were carried away to the Americas forcefully during the slave trade. And this is a key difference between the political awakening of the sojourning protagonist of the Anglo-Fante, and the titular one of the Sojourner. The circular messianic temporal logic of the third installment, retrospective, dictates that in order for the Sojourner to experience the awakening of a new African age, he must first take stock of Africa's embeddedness in histories of the Black Atlantic that were forged in slavery. That is to say, when Sekyi traces Kwesi's journal in his new poem, The Sojourner, and retraces it in it, he begins to toggle between references to the Anglo-Fante, to the Fante, to Africans, and Black people worldwide, right? So there's a kind of shift between how he's defining his protagonist in relationship to his communities. And this is not to say that the Sojourner is not deeply invested in the local or in kind of Fante matters, right? Rather, the poem itself is a site of negotiation between the local and different definitions of the national, inclusive of the Pan-African. That negotiation between different scales of modern Fante affiliation are already signaled in the change in title from the locally specific Anglo-Fante to the seemingly unmarked term Sojourner. When the Sojourner reckons with the past, the spirits that guide him first deploy the language of race to critique the racialization of freedom in the Americas. So there's this whole section that's about how freedom is not universal in the Americas because it's racialized as white. And then the spirits also kind of satirize the aesthetic principles of kind of Western modernity, right? According to which Black skin is derogated, while the porcine pink complexion of whites is lauded as inherently beautiful and somehow a vestige of the gods of ancient Greece. It's a really funny section about pigs. This interrogation of the anti-Blackness of post-Enlightenment aesthetics appears immediately after the stanzas that discuss the plights of Africans in the diaspora and on the continent together, right? And this section kind of extends the comparison between the political legacies of slavery in different parts of the Atlantic to their cultural afterlives, to kind of the realm of aesthetics. And here I want to kind of, again, zoom out. I've been kind of zooming out of different scales and note that Sekyi is not working this figure out in a cultural vacuum. This is, when I talk about this kind of being a figure of modernity, he's doing this in a community that's also thinking about the Sojourner and using Sojourner in all these kind of interesting ways. And as historian Hakim Adi reminds us, the Sojourn appears as a leitmotif in historical accounts of West African students in Britain. And he has all these articles about kind of Sojourner students. He's demonstrated how the historical phenomenon of Africans who sojourned abroad was key to the development of a Pan-African political consciousness of their compatriots in Africa, not least because this period of dislocation placed Africans in Britain in direct contact with African descendants from the West Indies and the US, but also Africans from other parts of Africa that end up in Britain, right? So according to Adi, the Sojourn transformed them, quote, even if only temporarily, as part of the diaspora, end quote. So this kind of idea of the Sojourner as a temporary diasporic figure. If Sekyi kept returning to this figure, it's because it haunts the Gold Coast press more broadly. In fact, even a somewhat cursory browsing of the West African press alerts us to the ubiquity of this figure in literary text and editorials alike. And from the newspaper archives of the Gold Coast, the Sojourner emerges as a figure for Ghanaian modernity. And this, I argue, is one of the crucial differences between reading the Sojourner's serial installments in the Gold Coast Leader and reading the poem's parts that are collated into one page in the Negro World, where the term Sojourner does not have the same kind of web of associations or tractions. And what do I mean by web of associations? I'm going to kind of explain that now. So in the Gold Coast press, we encounter a lot of different kinds of sojourners. So what a sojourner is in Sekyi's text is not necessarily what this figure means or what this trope figures, right, for other writers, but it's everywhere. So whereas for Sekyi, the sojourner is an elite Black Fante student, for other writers, this term can also refer to traveling colonial bureaucrats who might not have the same kind of class status as the heroes of Sekyi's text. So for instance, concurrently to the serialization of Sekyi's The Sojourner in the Gold Coast Leader, so this was in winter, spring 1919, another serial about a sojourner was being serialized in the same paper. This was an autobiographical tale about a Gold Coast native, who's also a Gold Coast native clerk, who and his experiences in the Cameroons during World War I. And it's entitled My Sojourn in the Cameroons During the Peaceful Days by J.G. Mullen. And Stephanie Newell has written extensively about this. I recommend you read what she's written. Mullen's sojourns are, so this serial that's about a sojourner, right, is actually a sequel to another serial that is about the same sojourner, right? And it's called My Experience in Cameroons During the War, and that appeared in the Gold Coast Leader in 1916. So here too, we see the sojourner as a serial figure. But this figure is also not a student and not from the same elite class that Sekyi belonged to and wrote about. Moreover, his sojourn takes place within Africa and across two empires and does not map onto Sekyi's route from Ghana to London and back. In addition to figuring West Africans abroad and West Africans serving in other colonial sites, the terms sojourner and sojourn were frequently mobilized in accounts about the comings and goings of European white colonial officials or traders. So now you can also find people writing about white people as sojourners, right? So, for example, in January 1919, a reader of the Gold Coast Leader writes to the editor and stresses the need for greater political representation, quote, in and for West African communities in which Europeans are sojourning clearly and solely for purposes of trade, end quote. Similarly, in an article on the end of Sir Hugh Clifford's mandate as Cape Coast governor, the article's author references to him and his wife, who are being transferred to Nigeria, as sojourners. And this is happening in the very same issue that the editor is writing an editorial. It's commenting on the first installment of Sekyi's Sojourner. So he's using the same word in two different editorials to talk about these white colonials and to talk about Sekyi's Sojourner. Right. What all these types of sojourners have in common, the ones I've discussed so far, that their terms of exile or dislocation are temporary. So this kind of aligns with Hakim Adi's definition of sojourners as kind of temporary suspended diaspora, right? Except for these white figures who then suddenly get written into this narrative, right? Since sojourners were both African students in Britain, but also white colonial officials in West Africa, we might want to think of the sojourner figure as figuring a non-settler colonial modernity, right? That is inhabited differently and experienced differently, but it's a non-settler colonial modernity for Blacks and whites, right? However, this reading of the slippery figure of the sojourner gets complicated by the fact that it also appears in Ghanaian discussions about the diaspora. So for instance, in 1921, in a March 12 issue of the Gold Coast Leader, the editor refers to the tragedy of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and their forced migration to the US, as in theft, right, as their enforced sojourn. And he contends that, I quote, in truth, the modern American is doing something as equally criminal as their ancestors. For whereas his ancestors dragged the African from his home by the sword, the present day white American is lynching him in the home of his enforced sojourn, end quote. This particular deployment of the term sojourner to refer to people of African descent in the Americas is consistent with the way that a very important Ghanaian writer called Casely Hayford is using the term in his novel Ethiopia Unbound. And there he uses the term sojourner about 3 or 4 times, and every time he uses it, it's to talk about African Americans. So the common denominator for all these different references to sojourners and sojourns in the Gold Coast Leader is their state of suspension and a kind of state of difference. And as a serially produced figure of displacement and mobility, a stranger in a strange land, the sojourner of the Gold Coast Press, which is this kind of sedimented, weird figure that figures all kinds of different things, he disarticulates and rearticulates different places and identities in kind of vexed and messy ways across ethnic, racial, imperial, and linguistic differences. So in the section that follows now, I will discuss what happens to the West African keyword, and I'm thinking about this sojourner as a keyword, and to the figure when this poem that I've been mentioning, Sekyi's poem, is being reprinted in Harlem, where the referential contexts that I have hitherto outlined do not register or really translate. So my second part is about the sojourner in Harlem. And I'm going to give you a little backstory to how we end up with the sojourner in Harlem. So a Pan-African culture of reprinting brought the sojourner to New York. Duz Muhammad Ali, the editor of the now defunct journal, the African Times Orient Review, had been recently employed by Garvey to head the Foreign Affairs and African Affairs section of the paper. And it was he who brought it to William Ferris. But Ali had also employed Ferris, Garvey, and Sekyi, and another person who was writing for My brain just died. John Edward Bruce, who's working for the Negro World. So all of these people are writing for the African Times or Review. The paper goes defunct, and then for a very brief moment, they're all kind of publishing something within the Negro World. So I'm kind of interested in that moment of kind of very temporary transfer from one Pan-African paper to another. And it is through Muhammad Ali that who recommends Sekyi's poems that we actually get Sekyi's poems inside of the Negro World. That's the backstory. But it did not make it to the Negro World without alterations. And you know, the first difference, as I said, is they're no longer serial installments, right? The second is the kind of the weird formatting of the poem. So what happens is that the line endings don't correspond anymore, right? So these are kind of things that I think are interesting, but are not necessarily as important as the next thing that I want to discuss, which is a kind of a weird addition of a gloss. So the changes that Ferris makes to the poem's line length speak to the technical problems that are involved in remediating a long serialized African poem to the kind of preset column size of a different diasporic paper. Then when Ferris inserts a footnote and a gloss into this poem, we see a kind of parallel thing that he's trying to do. He's trying to kind of stabilize the Black reference to a poem as it's kind of circulating within a Pan-African culture of reprinting. Now, the gloss that I'm referring to here is not a foreign term or toponym. Rather, it is the pronoun ye that he glosses. Ye being the antiquated version of the second person plural you, which is most obviously the pronoun of collective address or interpolation, right? And the speaker's addressee, the ye, is the grammatical subject of the first lines of the sixth section. Yet ye who felt the shame and pain of slaving in a milder strain. That's kind of where this happens. The legend printed below the poem specifies that this ye refers to, I quote, African Negroes. No such gloss appears in the Gold Coast Leaders edition. Ferris's decision to clarify that the addressee of this section are African Blacks specifically, and not all people of African descent more broadly, can thus be understood in terms of what Brent Edwards has called the diasporic framing gesture. Right? This is attested by the fact that Ferris does not gloss each instance of ye, just this one. And by adding this gloss, he seems to anticipate some kind of diasporic décalage, but also misinterpretation between the original Ghanaian readership of the Sojourner and the new American Caribbean readers of the Negro World's reprint. But the fact of that gloss, that it's entered, suggests that it is necessary here, right? But not in the Gold Coast Leader. And that insertion only ends up inscribing the décalage between the two communities into this poem. By specifying that this ye, who were slaving in a milder strain and had lost their manhood and milder heritage, were Africans, it is as if Ferris is preemptively trying to interrupt a misinterpolation. Its insertion seems to quite emphatically say, not ye, readers outside of Africa. Right? Ferris's gloss can be understood as an attempt to translate, so to speak, a text originally addressed to Africans to a new readership that, while Black, also included non-African Blacks. Though this gloss forecloses the Black American reader's identification with the poem's address, it stages another kind of interpolation, right? That of an editor to new readers. The footnote underscores the fact that this address is being read secondhand, so to speak, reminding readers that they are not the original addressees or readers of that ye, the way that some other readers, presumably African ones, were. As such, this asterisk on the page reassigns potential addressees to the role of witnesses of a specifically African scene of interpolation. Now, if Ferris's gloss served to differentiate the speaker's African addressee from his diasporic overhearers, the wholesale elision of the original version's epilogue, addressed to England, as it's cut out from this conversation, it also cuts England from this diasporic address, right? And the Negro World edition ends with the section to Africa, right? And it kind of ends kind of like an amatory poem. And that seems to be kind of the return to Africa is happy at the end, right? But as I observed in the previous section, Sekyi's belated edition of the epilogue to the Sojourner, over 2 years after his first four installments had been published, suggested that this was a continuing story, right? And it's interesting that that gets cut out of this new edition. So while thematically this epilogue brings us back to where we started with the Sojourner, his reflections on his erstwhile love for England and his disillusionment, at no point does the speaker set foot in England again. And this is what's being cut. So I'm addressing now kind of the thing that's actually not in this version anymore, right? It is this epilogue, and this poem is really kind of a whole address to Albion, to England, but it's actually not about English soil the way that the first two sections of the poem were. It's all about this kind of shadowy world empire. So how canst thou build a world empire, the Sojourner asks, and weld all nations into one, whilst thou dost rouse with each nation's ire by scorning all and helping none. The amorphousness of this world empire suggested again and again in the Sojourner's references to different forms of direct and indirect rule, Britain's meddling in the business of chiefs and kings, but also its role in destabilizing other kinds of monarchies. So Albion thus exerts influence over the world by supporting others to despise his king's and chief's authority, and by its tendency to dissension sow, and to kind of slight every king by thine. Sekyi's pessimistic vision of Britain as an empire whose reach extends everywhere dampens the euphoric mode of the two earlier Afrocentric installments, not least because it undercuts the message about the rewards of embracing one's culture and turning away from British false values. So the two poems end very differently. One ends, the Negro World one ends with this kind of return to Africa. The Gold Coast Leaders one ends with a kind of understanding of the British Empire as a totality. And it's kind of wondering, what does it mean to even want to return to Africa if Britain is everywhere? And it's actually in some ways anticipating some critiques that will happen after decolonization. So now I'm going to talk about kind of the last section is going to be about what happens when we consider the Sojourner as a figure within this newspaper alongside other kinds of figures of Black exile and displacement. So although the dictionary definition and biblical connotations of the term Sojourner would have been familiar to US readers, the term itself was not salient in the African-American press of the 1920s. In the Negro World, the term Sojourner is not a keyword the way it had been in the Gold Coast Leader. And instead of being legible as a repeating serial figure for West African modernity, as it had been in the Gold Coast Leader's printing, Sekyi's Sojourner is placed into relation with a host of African-American and West Indian migrant figures associated with the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance instead. So these include the Southern migrant, the Caribbean immigrant, the sailor, the Black veteran returning from Europe. And when I say the Sojourner is placed into relation with these other Black figures, I'm referring to the newspaper's paratactical mode of representation, by which text and images are printed directly alongside each other, appear on the same spread, or are grouped together by virtue of their publication in the same issue of the paper. The paratactical joining of figures of Black displacement in the Negro World interests me precisely because the nature of their joining is not represented in narrative terms. It was up to the reader to make sense, or not, of these different types of montage. Right? So on page 3 of, and I think we maybe go forward a few slides. There's one with a so further. We don't need to. Let's see. Sorry, I think 2 more maybe. That. Okay, thank you. So that one. Thank you. So on page 3 of the May 12, 1922 issue of the Negro World, that's the same one where the Sojourner appeared, is an advertisement that reads, "Listen, tell it to the Negroes of the world through the Negro World." The paper with a large local, national, international corporation reaches all, enlightens all. So of course it's an ad, so it's not necessarily kind of a primer for how to read the Negro World, but I think it's really significant, right? Because the joint imperative to listen and tell it to the Negroes of the world is an apt way of representing the Negro World's practical project, right? Writing about the particularities of one Black community in one column and reading about another in the column next to it. It represents, on a diasporic scale, an act of hailing readers into a relationship akin to, but not quite identical to, the simultaneity that Anderson famously ascribes to members of a nation in imagined communities. Now, in the practice of diaspora, Brent Edwards has illuminated the way that periodicals have provided the technical means for representing the imagined community of diaspora and not just the nation. So Edwards argues that a transnational community of race, quote, structured by Décalage, involves a special sort of imaginative work, end of quote. And it involves a way of conceiving relation that is not reducible to Anderson's simultaneity, but might be better understood as coevalness. And here he cites Johannes Fabian's idea of coevalness, which, I quote, covers both synchronous events occurring at the same physical time, and the contemporary, co-occurrence in typological time, and moreover connotes answerability, a common active occupation or sharing of time. As a model for dialogue and exchange, reciprocity would attend to the décalage of diaspora by ensuring coevalness in the very structure of any Black internationalist endeavor. And this was a block quote from Brent Edwards. Well, Edwards is writing about coevalness and the décalage of diaspora in the context of Black text circulating between Black Anglophone and Francophone journals. These theoretical concepts apply to reprinting texts in English across the diaspora. Even when the term sojourner, whose dictionary definition is the same in African American and Ghana, it registers very differently, right, in these respective print cultures. The West African figure of the sojourner has no one-to-one counterpart in America, precisely because it represents a Ghanaian way of figuring the connections between different histories of Black alienation under the shadow of slavery and colonization on one hand, and figuring the connections between white colonial officials in Africa and African colonial students of Britain on the other, right? So this is kind of how it figures this displacement and exile and mobility, right, which works slightly differently to the figures we think of in terms of kind of the New Negro movement, right? It is in the pages of the Negro World that the figures of the sojourner and the New Negro encounter each other as coeval, but not identical. And it is precisely this command to both listen and tell that I've been pointing to in this ad that structures the relationship between members of the Negro World's imagined community as a practice of coevalness that requires reciprocity. And now I want you to, I'm going to end with this kind of reading of an article. I want you to consider how texts in the May 13, 1922 issue of the Negro World make the West African sojourner student coeval with the West Indian student in America, the West Indian laborer in America, but also African American intellectuals and workers who end up in the North, but are originally from the South. And this is something that's been constantly mentioned in newspapers. To illustrate my point, I want to draw your attention to an article printed in the same issue that I was been referring to, and it was a reprint from The Messenger, but had some editorial framing in it. So in it, the Randolph, who is the editor of The Messenger, he is confronting people who are critiquing Garvey for basically dismissing Garvey for being West Indian, right? Saying if they say go back to the West Indies if you're not happy with racial relations in the US, right? This is going to be saying that this is like a ludicrous way to reject Garvey. If you're going to reject Garvey, reject him on the basis of his political opinions, not on this kind of bizarre idea that he has no right to comment on racial relations in the US. So I'm going to read from this this little article. It says, if Garvey does so, he's dismissing the common jibe. I quote, if Garvey doesn't like this country, let him go to Jamaica, where he came from. And he says it's analogous to saying, you know, if Randolph himself doesn't like segregation in New York, let him go back to Florida. If Du Bois doesn't like the Ku Klux Klan in New York, let him go back to Atlanta. If Kelly Miller doesn't like the Jim Crow car of Maryland, let him go back to South Carolina. And he kind of goes on and on with these lists. And then he ends this section by saying, well, you know, not only is this crazy, right, but also nationality is not the most important axis of violence in the lives of these activists, right? He says he has a right to fight, he being any person of Black descent, has a right to fight to improve not only his home, but any other home he'd be able to help. If a Negro is in Georgia and the hillbillies instigated by silk-gloved, respectable citizens decide to lynch him, he's simply a racial slur. Whether he comes from Georgia or Georgetown, British Guyana, they care nothing whether he's from Jamaica, Florida, Trinidad, or Tennessee, St. Kitts or Mississippi, Barbados or Alabama. All Negroes, wherever they are born, suffer from common prescriptions, wanton narrowing of opportunities, segregation, discrimination, Jim Crow cause, laws against marriage, and race and color determine these classifications, not the place of birth. So Randolph's analogy between disqualifying Garvey from fighting racism in the US and barring African American leaders who had migrated from the US to the North, from kind of talking about civil rights movements, highlights the bizarre nationalist and xenophobic strain of anti-Garveyism and underscores the importance of Black internationalism to any local Black struggle. This article ends with a reminder that West Indians are, I quote, among the foremost fighters in all cities for our rights. They're assiduous workers, vigorous fighters, diligent and able students, end quote. When we read this article in relationship to The Sojourner, another text from that issue that spotlights a Black migrant figure experiencing a political awakening, but in relation to other Black people across the world, and as a student, it's interesting to think about kind of how we might rethink then, the West Indian sojourner in relationship to the West African sojourner. Not rethink maybe, but kind of think about them as opposite figures, right? And this also brings kind of Garvey into the conversation, right? Because Garvey was a West Indian student in Britain before he came to the US. So I don't have a way to conclude this paper, and I want to kind of actually talk about this with people if they're still here. Because I'm interested in kind of thinking about this encounter of two different ways of representing the relationship between the national and the international, right? Between diaspora and the local, that are kind of most richly understood in the print context. They travel and are juxtaposed. But the thing is, this moment in which the Sojourner is reprinted, even though we see lots of different poems by Sekyi, it doesn't change literary history, right? It's not as if suddenly people read this and it changes the way they represent Black exile, right? But I'm interested kind of in these moments that are ephemeral, but stage a kind of world literary commingling of texts and tropes within different Black literary traditions. So I am going to shut up right now and open it up to questions, hopefully. Thank you so much for your patience for listening to this paper. Oh, I can't hear you.
Thank you so much, Marina, for that lovely talk. And there's actually a lot in that, so I hope we can get to a lot of it. Not only is the text rich, but it has many versions, as you say. So there's quite a bit to say, and I really hope that we'll get a chance to talk about the terms that you activate in the talk, Décalage and others too. So I'm going to invite people to. Michael already has invited people to put questions in the chat, and we'll address as many of them as possible. I think some people will have looked at the text before today, and others perhaps not. But please don't let that deter you. If you have a question, please add it to the chat.
Yeah, Michael has shared the handout in the chat, I think, so people can see it.
Yeah, I wonder, maybe I'll...
A question from Stephanie Newell. Do you want to take that first?
Yes, of course. Hi, Steph.
Okay, let me just unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that brilliant paper. That was so interesting. And, as somebody that's very immersed in West African newspaper cultures and Sekyi's work there, it's been really fascinating to hear your talk, especially how you think through the word sojourner. That's just been so enlightening, actually. I've got a few questions, obviously. Did Sekyi respond to the reprint? Obviously he would have known about it. So is there any evidence of what he thought about the reprint and the sort of reframing? And then my big question about Sekyi is something you raised at the start, which is the figure of the sojourner is a male figure. And Sekyi was notoriously misogynistic. He described British suffragettes as, quote, unsexed abortions who should be exiled along with Napoleon to the same island, Elba.
That's fun, actually.
He was, and I'm interested in how the gender conservatism maps into the cultural nationalism of the sojourner and maps into the figure of the sojourner in the way that you're talking about it. And that's partly it's because I've recently been reading Anthony Reid's brilliant essay on Claude McKay's Banjo, which are all around the issue that this topic of woman being a conjunction. kind of facilitating a homosocial space. And I'm just wondering if there's a kind of way in which, you know, how the invisibility of women in the figure of the sojourner, how that can be made visible, or in what way it's made visible. And, you know, so questions around gender, if that's possible to think through.
Thank you so much, first of all, for coming. And I was like terrified of talking about all this stuff in front of you because you're like the biggest expert.
No.
But so I have no idea if Sekyi was aware of this, because I think, isn't this like right around the time when there are all these kind of sanctions on the Negro World circulating? So I'm wondering, I mean, I have no idea whether the last epilogue is cut because they never read it or because they decided to do it kind of on purpose, right? So I haven't found any record of Sekyi commenting on this reprint, which is kind of interesting. I mean, though, you know, as you know, he's very ambivalent about Garvey, but there's no mention of in any of the editorials or anything that I've read by him. But if you find something, I would be fascinated. In terms of the gender question, I think one part that I wanted to kind of talk about in this paper, but I just didn't have time, and I apologize for like speeding through the last sections and sounding like Speedy Gonzalez. But I feel like in the US press, people would have immediately thought of Sojourner Truth when they saw that this is something. Then, and I've talked about this with a wonderful colleague of mine here at Wesley, and she was like, "What, are you talking about Sojourner Truth?" And I was like, "No," but that makes sense, right? Because so I actually think in some ways the first reference that people would have had to that term would have been like one of the most important African American female activists, right, of the 19th century. So I think that's another way in which the different kind of referential contexts or like kind of associations with these terms actually do get messed up in kind of productive ways. I can't prove this, but I'm just like, that's the only, whenever you actually Google or try to find the term sojourner in the Negro world, nobody uses that term. When they do, it's as the name Sojourner Truth. So I do think that would have been the association, because I agree with you, it's a very masculinist term. And I try to kind of mention this in the talk, the Sekyi, the sojourner, is always male. I'm not finding a lot of references to female sojourners in the Gold Coast press, except often for these like white ladies who are like wives of colonial officials. So they also kind of become but they're sojourners because they are accompanying male sojourners, right? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to figure out how to talk about Sojourner Truth without doing too much like weird speculation. So yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe I can add one question to that, which is a little bit different, but there is a line in the poem of "Far from my home, I sojourn in a land." Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you have thoughts about this, but there is a kind of way in which is the sojourner idea sort of a kind of a land idea in a sense, that is to say, like, you know, if you sort of think about sort of theory from the late 20th century onward, and you think about sort of the Black Atlantic and sort of metaphors of travel over water and that whole sort of phalanx of sort of metaphors and theory, Sojourner seems to be different, especially the land sort of there's something about sort of being on land, sort of on the street, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that sort of speaks to you, to your version of it. You've looked at all the versions, so I wonder if is Sojourner kind of something that's happening on land?
That's an interesting point, and I hadn't really thought about it. Maybe, I mean, I think that the thing with the sojourner is that it's such a kind of fuzzy figure, right? A sojourner is basically anyone who's like dislocated. So in some ways, for me, it's like somebody who's like left a land. But there's not so much of an emphasis on that journey, right? With the Black Atlantic, there's an interesting like what happens in the ship, right? How that becomes also a way of thinking about Black modernity as being forged in the ship, right? Even though Sekyi actually has a catastrophic, is like shipwrecked and is in this horrible accident, this is actually not part of the Sojourner story. So I don't know, but it is interesting because I think, and I wonder if some of this links to his reusing of Thompson, because I think the Sojourner is rewriting like Thompson's Seasons, but kind of playing with ideas of English as being like, England is terrible, there's the worst place ever, right? As opposed to England's great. So I wonder if that's also where the kind of the landedness, the street, be important, because then they vanish from later parts of. So it's almost like a Sojourner, because it has all these different installments, is different poems, and has different kinds of ways of representing what the Sojourn is.
Well, let me again invite people to post questions or unmute themselves, or let us know if you want me to. Let us know if you want us to unmute you.
So the question is, what does this relationship with transformation say about the relationship of Africans in Africa who exclude the diaspora with the meaning of being African? I think this question refers to the weird gloss of Yi. I mean, I think this is kind of like what I'm trying to figure out, what this weird moment of like, you don't identify, right? Because usually when we think about hailing, it's kind of an opening up of like who can also imagine themselves in, but this is like a, gentle readers do not identify with this moment. I find it really bizarre. I mean, also it makes sense, he's trying to do some kind of pedagogy of this. So I'm not sure what it does to kind of a transformation. I think it's Ferris being really invested in marketing this text as an African text. And I think it's got to do with kind of his desire to present this kind of as a Black world literary text. And I think Ferris is really invested in this. And here's why I think this is the case. Like this, he's publishing the Sojourner a few months after he's written a long review of Batuala, which I kind of mentioned at the beginning. And even though he praises Batuala as like great African text, again, it's not technically African, but never mind. It sometimes goes between like great African to great Negro text, right? He says the problem with this is, as wonderful as it is, as genius as it is literary realism. And the best literature is actually literary impressionism, which he defines as this kind of literature that doesn't represent people as they are, but as they could be, right? It kind of transforms the ordinary into something extraordinary and sees some potential. And he like goes to Shakespeare and Homer and Tennyson, I don't know why Tennyson, and kind of goes through various poets and kind of hopes for there to be kind of African literature that represents Africa as it can be, as opposed to kind of the sordid way that Africa is represented in Batuala. So I think that is why, and I didn't really get to talk about this in this talk, but I do think this is one of the reasons why he is specifying kind of the Africanness of this text, to kind of say, like, look at this, this is another kind of African text that exists next to something like Batuala, right? And I think this is why he calls these poems philosophical, to differentiate them and kind of from something like Batuala, which is realistic, right? And I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's actually it's less of a distancing politically, but actually a kind of a marking of an African text as an African literary text, if that makes sense.
Other questions?
Yes, and I've been trying to puzzle out this same thing about being able to apply Western intellectual influence to African needs. I think, yeah, I think he's kind of like, and I wonder to what extent Ferris wrote this and to what extent Ferris and Andrews Muhammad Ali wrote this together, because I think it's like a weird shorthand for saying what later critics would say, that he's able to take all these Western things not because he like worships at the altar of Anglomania, right, but rather he uses them to kind of further a either an anti-colonial agenda or something else. But the phrasing of it is weird, right? It's kind of problematic. It's just like he never actually explains also what he means, like what are African needs, which part of Africa. So there is a weird flattening, right? Even as on the editorial level, he's trying to kind of differentiate, right? There's like a difference between like Africans and African Americans, but in the actual note, there's a complete flattening of kind of nuance, I think, that is really interesting. Oh, Steph?
Oh. Yeah. I think it's very much about to do with what you're describing, to do with these different zones, these different regions, and different, it's again, because of having just read Banjo, there's a real there's a really problematic idea of West Africans, Senegalese in particular, in that text, and so it's when you gave that quotation from Ferris, it made me wonder if there is a kind of almost an anti-African, and the Back to Africa movements, Africa requiring, the kind of civilizing influence of African Americans. I just wondered if that sort of, that kind of thinking is embedded in this, in the sort of idea of Africa that is being presented here. It's certainly something that it seems to assume there's, you know, where is the African intellectual influence in that kind of comment? So maybe it's a question more generally about the Negro world that I don't know anything about, but whether, you know, whether ideas about back to Africa movements are based on a certain idea of a civilizing mission of African Americans.
Well, that's exactly what Sekyi opposes, right? In when he opposes Garvey, so that actually makes sense, right? Whenever Sekyi writes about he supports different parts of Garveyism that are about empowering Blackness and empowering Black people everywhere, right? But he is very skeptical about the idea of a kind of a repatriation. He's like, this is crazy, right? And he even at some point calls Garvey a white Black man, because he says that he still believes. So there are these moments in Sekyi's editorials that he's like really scathingly critical of Garvey, precisely for the terms that you are mentioning. And I think a lot of this does get condensed, but also the Negro World is like a really, because it is a paper, right? And because there's so many different ways of representing Africa that are not just editorials, right? And there's also the French page, right? So I think it's kind of difficult to speak generally about what happens in the pages of the Negro World. I mean, I think there is a kind of Garveyist agenda in it, and there are like crazy articles that are condescending and have this kind of missionary bent to them. But I think there are also texts that get published within that do kind of work against some of this. And I wonder in some ways if for Ferris, the whole kind of the serialization of Sekyi as an author, right, as opposed to serialization of the Sojourner, becomes a way of performing that African intellectual influence, right? So not to kind of say like, oh, this isn't problematic, I think it is, but I'm wondering if the actual kind of obsession with Sekyi as this kind of special kind of intellectual, right, who's figured out a way to kind of use something Western, whatever that means, becomes a way of actually promoting him as an African intellectual, and as a kind of model, and also kind of, I think, pointing to the differences between kind of a heterogeneity of literature that's either African or about Africa, right? Kind of as a counterpoint to something like Bachuala. So, but yeah, I think all your points about kind of the really strange framing that Ferris makes here, and I think kind of in other parts of the paper too, stand, yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about when you talked about the cutting out of the epilogue, is that you have examples of this in other instances. Obviously, you know, I'm thinking of like, you know, how like the northern part of Richard Wright's Black Boy doesn't get published together with the southern part, although that was the initial idea until much later, and so it's basically cut out. So I just wonder if like this it's making me think whether or not there's actually sort of that there's a way in which this problem recurs in Black literatures of the 20th century, and whether or not one can sort of think about that as a kind of something like a feature almost, or something that is sort of, it's not incidental, and therefore something that has to be factored into the way in which we read the archive, as it were.
That's a really interesting comment. I think I'd have to think about it more and figure out, what the differences are between these kind of abridgments, right? Because like I feel like there's a lot of abridging in general, and like in modernism too, and kind of the circulation of different editions. So, but I think one of the things that I'm scared of saying that this elision is on purpose, because I think even if it's not on purpose, it's significant because of it speaks to, the problems of collecting a text that is serial and that is piecemeal and that has these belated epilogues, right? So in some ways, the story continues differently in Ghana than it will continue in some ways. It's kind of like perfect, right? The difference is actually shown that like these tropes actually do circulate differently. And I think Britain is understood very differently in Ghana than it is in the US in the 1920s, despite all, Garvey's harsh critiques of Britain. And I think some of this has got to do with like, the interrupted circulation of Black papers at the time, right? It's interesting that usually we think about kind of how the Negro World gets repressed in Africa, right? I mean, which happens. We know this is recorded, right, because of colonial officials who kind of ban it, right? But then it's interesting to think about how also some African journals don't make it either on time or circulate with lags, or certain issues don't make it, right, to the US too. So that other leg of circulation is also interrupted, right? And that, I think, that definitely is a feature, I think, of Black internationalism.
I don't know if you want to say something about sort of like you're just, because you've spent so much time with this text now, I wonder if you just sort of say a word about it as a kind of, I don't know, something in the realm of your sort of affective relationship to the text. Only because, in one of my classes, we've been reading Alain Locke's sort of Enter the New Negro, the thing he writes in the early pages of that anthology. And there's a way in which I think it is, we've been, my students have been finding that it's a text that actually does elicit lots of emotions. And of course, so does Sekyi. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, I think one of the, I don't know if this is an emotion or a frustration, it's what I ended the talk with, is like trying to methodologically figure out how do you write about something like this that didn't get like a lot of critical attention, right? And not knowing, like, how do I not overstate this, right? Because I think this is probably people like, what is the influence of this? And like, I think it's really fascinating that it happened, even if it didn't necessarily have like an influence, right? It's not like how that suddenly people started writing about Sojourners. They didn't. So in some ways, nothing happened after this, right? So for me, it's the kind of frustration of like, this is so amazing and crazy. Why is nobody writing about this, right? So that to me, it's kind of the affect of okay, so how does the story continue, right? It's kind of wondering like how, wanting more of the show just to be serialized, right? Or just kind of have a backstory to, how people were reading about it. And this is the problem with a lot of kind of ephemeral text, or even just like people don't always write reception histories of poems they're reading in newspapers the way they do when you get a book and review it, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't comments. Like within the Gold Coast Theatre, people are thinking about like, oh, and the editor is commenting on the different installments of the Sojourner, but that can happen because it's being serialized. So they know that something has happened in the first installment, right? But when it's just out there and it's amongst like a billion other poems, even though it's that long, that you don't get that same kind of reception history. So I think for me, it's a kind of frustration of not knowing what its influence was, right? And kind of writing about things that are ephemeral. Like, how do you write a history of ephemeral world literature, right? And again, it's not ephemeral everywhere. Like clearly the Sojourner ends up being anthologized in Toni Martin's anthology of kind of Garveyist literature, which is kind of funny because Sekyi's not Garveyist. But again, it's an anthology that comes out but it doesn't necessarily change very much about the way we think about the text. So yeah, frustration, I think, is my emotion.
Fair enough. We're wrapping up pretty soon, but are there any last things?
Do we have any more questions? I mean, I don't know. I love to actually, if there's anybody left in the audience, talk about like, how do you write about things that didn't have influence, but are significant? Oh, Stephanie.
Sorry, again, it's me again. How do you write a history of ephemeral world literature? What's your answer?
I don't know. I'm asking you because you also write about it.
No, give us some ideas. This is crucial. It's crucial because what things that I work on that I call local literatures are ephemeral and not world literature by the definition of world literature as available throughout the world, right? Precisely because they're ephemeral and local, but they absolutely crucially, as you said in your talk, speak to issues in the world, of the world, literary aesthetics inspired by world literatures, so there's all kinds of ways in which the ephemeral and the local do speak into world literature and need to be accommodated. And I would absolutely love to hear how you're addressing it, even if it's just sort of speculative ideas about method. How do you write a history of ephemeral world literature? It just seems to me like the question for anyone working on newspapers and creativity in newspapers.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what I'm wrestling with. I mean, I feel like every chapter of the book in some ways is thinking about this. And I think the only way to think about it is kind of to not think about influence. I think influence is not useful. Because I think influence is one of the main thing we use in, or we have to think about or rethink influence, right? So when we talk about influence, world literature, we often think about, how did a text change, leave its, original location and influence somebody somewhere else, right? Or influence a style. And I think that line of thinking makes us forget that what if somebody is influenced by something like random from a newspaper and writing this, maybe in like, I don't know, a tiny newspaper in Ghana or Poland or wherever, but it doesn't change the way that national literature works, right? So kind of thinking about influences can the embedded worldliness of texts versus texts traveling across the world and influencing other people, which, people write about this, but I think influence is the thing that messes everything up for thinking about the worldliness of the ephemera, right? Or thinking about like how much did X change something, or how much did it change a literary culture? Because if you're doing it that way, then you miss all these other things. And I think DH might be helping us change the way we're thinking about this. And I don't mean like what is his name? Moretti. I don't mean in them kind of Moretti crazy, like, let's not look at text, but I mean like people who are doing stuff with like fugitive verse, like Ryan Cordell, and thinking about kind of the reprinting of weird 19th century poems, abolitionist context and things like that, where reprinting is not about influence, but it shows kind of like how texts are like circulating in really weird ways, right? But it's not about like a metric of this is really influential. So I think one way for me is to kind of let go of the bugbear of influence, and think about what is a worldly text or a world text that isn't influential, that doesn't have an afterlife, right? There's a question about my first encounter. I think it was Sojourner Truth. So that is a great comment, right? I think for me it is. I don't know if it would have been for readers in Ghana. This is why I think it's kind of fascinating, right? So yeah. If there is a problem with the need for influence, effect, impact, I'd love to hear more from this person. Hi.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that is a problem of the genre of the books that we're supposed to be writing as scholars, as academics. If it's not influence, then what are we using to structure these conversations or arguments? Like, is that that focus on impact or effect at some kind of noticeable scale? Is that in itself a problem?
Yes, I mean that's exactly what I'm trying to kind of think through, and I'm like, what is the alternative to it, right? Is coevalness a way of thinking about this too? Like, these texts are circulating at the same time. I think also the problem is that we actually can't measure influence because we don't have access to histories of reading in the way that we imagine. Like, we can trace influence right through publishing numbers and things like that, sometimes circulation numbers, but we also know that the way people read are not. So we actually never have proof except through a scholarly apparatus, right? Or kind of anecdotes. So yeah, there's, I mean, I think this is kind of like the job market scarred me forever when people were like, does this matter? And I was like, well, I don't know, do Marianne Moore's like little notes matter? But people are like fine with that, right? I think this actually, the question of influence and importance, I think weighs down certain literary fields more than others, right? So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to think like, what does influence mean? And what are the terms under which influence actually is legible, right? What are other, I don't know, in your work, like how you're thinking about writing, X is important because of Y, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Marianne Moore, because I've encountered this question in sort of very alternatively sort of histories of poetry, or especially quote unquote difficult or inaccessible poets. And that question of access is, I think, very complicated and layered. Accessible for whom? But I think that it's interesting that, as you say, certain literary fields or areas have to struggle with that more than others. And I'm thinking of that more broadly in the sense of how we assign value to certain kinds of inquiries. And sort of who decides that, why can't it just be, yes, this is fascinating, and like who sets the protocol of where we take it from there? Because I think I do have some reservations about like scholarly work absolutely needing to be useful. I think that in itself worries me. So yeah, that's just where I was coming from.
Yeah, these are wonderful remarks, and it's like I feel like very much in line is how I've been thinking, but also like what's the kind of the internal voice of doubt as I write, kind of making things legible. I think that's another way of thinking also about making things useful, right? Who is the audience, and like also like what we think. Like I don't frame my stuff on the Sojourner as recovery, because it actually, that's the sad thing. Like I feel like the Sojourner has been recovered. Like Toni Martin put in an anthology and then nothing happened, right? So there are kind of, I like how Bridget Fielder writes about kind of recovery. Recovery has all these like bad metaphors of kind of excavation, right? As opposed to thinking about these continuous projects of kind of recovering the way we think about the canon, right? The canon is the thing that needs to be recovered, not these texts, right? Recovered as in like is in recovery, right? So I'm wondering if also thinking about influence might be another way of getting at this, right? Kind of like getting out of the idea that maybe influence is not the only metric we can think about for understanding when a text becomes world literature, right? Because I think this question of influence registers differently in different, where you are in terms of local, national, canon, not canon, right? But then in terms of world literature, I think influence is like one of the key things. Influence and travel, right? Those are the two things you need to focus on if you're defining world literature. But there are so many texts that travel without being influential. So for me, that then becomes a methodological question, also like under which, and I think kind of what you're saying too, like under which circumstances are texts traveling, which infrastructures support that travel and which ones don't, right? So it's a question kind of infrastructure, aesthetics, and idea, kind of metrics of influence and importance, right? And again, I think access literally in a material way too, in terms of like people have access to newspapers more than they have to certain other kinds of texts, right? And we read some texts for the first time in newspapers, not in books, right? So yeah, but thank you. This is kind of a really useful conversation.
Thank you, Leah. Anybody else as we draw to a close? Did you say that he also did serialized essays?
Yes, I mean he kind of does. He writes these kind of feuilletons, right? That he has something like about white people, and it's like 7 parts or something, and they actually have parts within the thing. So it's not just like the serial. You can tell that he's actually written it in parts, but then the parts themselves have like serial sections. Our White Friends, yes. Which makes me think of like Our Mutual Friend, but it's like Our White Friends. It's not a novel. It's a series of, and they're kind of loosely connected because that's what the newspaper does. It lets you kind of return to a topic. So yeah, Sekyi, I think for me, it really is useful as a kind of serial author, and kind of for thinking about kind of how does the serial become, how does the serial a feature of the Ghanaian Sojourner? And that for me is kind of important to thinking about, not just for Sekyi, but also for various other people who are writing about this figure and are defining the Sojourner very differently. And this is why I'm kind of interested in keywords, right? Thinking about kind of how the Sojourner becomes a racial keyword, even though we don't think about it in racial terms, right? But the fact that it's either this like white colonial figure in West Africa or this African going to Britain, like that is like literally racialization, right? So for me, Sojourner actually is like a weird racial keyword for thinking through like how modernity is represented in the Gold Coast press, and then how that kind of gets weirdly messed up when it travels to like another Black paper, right?
Well, Marina, I want to thank you so much for being our first guest in the series this year. I think this is a really wonderful way to begin.
Thank you, people, for coming. I'm sorry I can't see you. I'm very grateful for your questions and for just like sitting through kind of weird, long-winded talk. So thanks so much.
It's really great. I'm really anxious to hear more about the project, especially when you are here in New York in the spring.
Yes, I will bother you as much as you will tolerate me.
So please get in touch with when you're here, and best of luck with the project.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Take care.
Bye.